Well, hey there, Kelly. So these agencies are saying that Hamas has positioned itself as this defender of Palestinians, trying to portray themselves across parts of the Arab and Muslim world as the lone group fighting back against Israel as the Palestinian death toll climbs. Now, as we've heard from the Biden administration, it's Hamas that hides behind these civilians, using them as human shields as Israel tries to fight back. And despite the group's horrific attack on October 7th, brutally murdering Israelis and details of sexual violence against Israeli women, Hamas propaganda videos cast them as these moral fighters. There's a visible example of the support for Hamas as Yemen's Houthi forces continue their attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea, saying that they won't stop until Israel ends their attacks in Gaza. We're also seeing continued attacks on U.S. forces in the Middle East linked to Iran-backed groups, the latest at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq just last night. We've seen the U.S. taking steps to build a multinational task force to deter and counter these attacks in the Red Sea as a show of force. Despite a few retaliatory attacks, the Biden administration still has not been able to stop the attacks on U.S. forces. Kelly.
Yes, and we will continue that conversation in a moment. Kelly Meyer, thank you. Here with us now is retired Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Wonderful to have you. So we will get to those attacks in just a moment, but as we hear these calls for a ceasefire, in practical application, what would that mean during this stage of the war, not only for Israel's ground operation, but also Hamas's ability to regroup?
Well, thank you for having me, and I think that's an important point. You know, I think the Israelis would welcome short period ceasefires for the exchange of hostages and for the movement of humanitarian supplies. But they can't have a UN-dictated, persistent ceasefire from which they'll never get underneath, because I believe they have 3 to 4 more weeks of combat operations they have to execute in Gaza to destroy Hamas as a military entity. And that is their #1 goal. And, you know, and the United States has supported them in that. We need to continue to support them in that. And so the United States needs to prevent the United Nations from attempting to impose an action in a ceasefire in Gaza before Hamas's military arm is defeated.
Understood. And moving back to those attacks, how difficult is it to prevent attacks on ships in the Red Sea and U.S. bases in this part of the world specifically?
Well, first, you know, I'm glad we're doing this, taking what was Coalition Combined Task Force 153 and expanding it to the Red Sea. But to be clear, that is only deterrence by denial. In other words, protecting the ships out at sea. The Biden administration, I believe, needs to conduct deterrence by punishment, which is to go out and strike the Houthi launch sites that are firing these weapons out there. We're in a very bad cost and position curve. Each time we shoot down one of these drones, many of the times we're firing $2.2 million standard missiles at a $50,000 or less drone. This is the wrong side of the cost curve to be on. We need to go strike these Houthi launch sites in Yemen and impose some cost on them. Otherwise, we won't deter action. The patrols are good for defensive purposes, but they will not stop the attacks.
Do you believe that one reason why some of those areas aren't being targeted is because it's just incredibly difficult to find them?
Not for the launch sites. I mean, we can see the launch sites. You know, we can detect the launches and we could strike them fairly quickly thereafter if we had, you know, patrolling, you know, aircraft within a reasonable distance. I'm confident we could strike them. I say the same for the sites that are striking our soldiers in Iraq and Syria, our ground forces. We've been very lucky. It's been a mixture of good missile defense and luck that's allowed us to avoid getting hit, to avoid losing a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine. We're going to lose one soon, and then I'm afraid the administration will have to overreact. So really, the right thing to do is to do a strike against Houthi and other IRGC-supported proxies who are striking U.S. forces, and to do it in a meaningful way now to deter further action later.
So switching gears now, if we could, to Russia and the Ukraine war there. So we're hearing reports that Russian soldiers on the front lines are now facing outbreaks of mouse fever. This is an illness spread by rodents, that morale is low, drug use is up. Considering these circumstances, how do you foresee this conflict moving forward at this juncture?
Well, it shouldn't surprise us that the Russians are having trouble with their frontline forces now. They've lost a lot of their original army, the army they had in February 2022. I think the British military has done a good study on this that shows they've had significant casualties or significant wounds to those forces. And as a result, they really do have, former penal colony members and, draftees up on the front lines. And so things like this are much more likely to happen among less disciplined forces. That doesn't mean they can't hurt Ukraine. And it isn't really these ground forces that are hurting Ukraine. It is just the massive cruise missile, ballistic missile, and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities that I think put the most pressure on Ukraine right now. So while I think the Russian army is struggling, there's still a lot of support that's needed to Ukraine to make sure that they can fend off these air attacks.
So we're also hearing North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is threatening nuclear attacks. As a holistic approach to all that's happening around the world, what do these threats say to you?
Well, I think we've now mentioned, I don't think we've mentioned China yet, but I'll tell you that, you kind of have these four countries, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, that are an axis of disruptors. They constantly going around trying to disrupt and cause chaos for kind of transparent, rules-based Western democracies. I think Kim Jong-un wants some attention, and we do need to make the proper investments in the missile defense of our homeland against a North Korean attack. As unlikely as it is, he's a very hard leader to predict. And he funds all this through cyber criminal activity. And we need to try to shut that off too, so that he has less money for these nuclear weapon and ballistic missile programs.
All right. Mark Montgomery, thank you as always.